All
right, let's
Mike.
do it. Good morning, everybody. My name is Mike Fialco, and I'm the new division director of urogynecology. And I couldn't be happier to introduce Dr. Tony Visco, who is a division director at Duke University. I've known Tony since I applied, I think, back at UNC in, God, too many years ago. But he's a professor, chief of division of urogyn at Duke now. He spent, after fellowship at Duke, under some very esteemed urogynecologists. He worked at UNC for 7 years and then returned to Duke in 2007. And just to summarize Tony very quickly, he's been one of the PIs on the Pelvic Floor Disorders Network. And I will often introduce papers in my talks, particularly about Botox, where I say this is one of the most important publications that's come out in urogynecology in the last 10 years in New England Journal of Medicine. And Tony is the first author of the vast majority of those articles. He's really a remarkable scientist that has done really some of the most critical work in urogyn that there is. He's also passionate, and I got in his CV about innovation and entrepreneurship, has invented, patented, commercialed a number of medical devices, on top of being one of the nicest people in urogynecology and also one of the funniest, which I value very, very highly. So I have to read this thing about the land and labor acknowledgement, but I just want to introduce Tony. We all wish he was here in person because he's an incredible speaker and a very, very nice, funny guy. But with that, I'm going to introduce Tony. But we would like to begin today by acknowledging that we are on the unceded ancestral lands of the Coast Salish, Duwamish, Stillaguamish, and Squamish people who have resided on and stewarded this land since time immemorial and who are still here alive and strong. In addition, we respectfully acknowledge the labor and exploitation of millions of Black and brown bodies upon which this country, institution, and our understanding and practice of medicine were built. We are indebted to their unwilling sacrifices. Tony, the floor is yours. Thank you so much. And everybody, please mute while you're listening.
Great. Thanks so much for that warm introduction. I would like to be there in person, but I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you this morning. Let's see if I think you can see my screen. So this is a very atypical talk for me. So I'm usually like talking about like RCTs or like research. This is a very different talk. So let's see how this goes. So how many times have you had an idea and you just didn't know what to do with it? So I'm going to talk through a little bit of the process, my sort of guide to, I think, responsible entrepreneurship and innovation, and talk to you through a couple different things that I've done along the way. It's certainly been a different, part of my brain that I've been using lately. So my disclosures is stock ownership in Nenomed, a company that I formed, and a patent that we're going to talk about that's off-label use of anticholinergic medications. Don't try this at home. This is just something that has the potential. The objectives for today is to list the main regulatory pathways that one would bring typically a medical device to market. I'm going to describe bootstrapping, which is this kind of concept where you start a company without anybody else's money and you do it slowly and from the ground up, literally, and describe the process of how you take an idea and you work through the process of prototype development or just kind of idea development to commercialization, which used to sound like a bad word to me, but basically almost all the products that we use in the hospital or in the operating room or on labor and delivery needed to be commercialized in order to make them viable to kind of share with people. So the FDA's job is really to protect us, right? To protect the health of the public. And in doing so, to kind of regulate both medical devices and pharmaceuticals. And to do that, they kind of break up the devices into three main categories, starting based on risk, basically. So class 1 products are typically low risk. So in many of them, like surgical drapes or things like that, have relatively low risk. So it's a different pathway, a faster pathway. Class 2 is kind of moderate risk. And in that situation, it's kind of like instrumentation, things like that you might think of. And I'll show you kind of the pathway for that. And class 3 are higher risk products. Usually we were thinking about it in the old days about like defibrillators or implantable devices, and vaginal mesh, which kind of was at its peak around 2012 and 13, was up classified. It used to be a class 2 product, and now it's a class 3 product. And there are some serious implications for that. So when you look at the overall pathway all the way on the left, a class 1 product which is probably where people should start to think of as they're getting started. If in this area, it requires FDA registration. So you have to register a couple different things, but it doesn't require a lot of studies because it's generally a low risk sort of proposal. Class 2, sort of medium risk, requires this thing called a 510K pathway. And you love it or you hate it, but it's currently still available. And the general mechanism of that is that you have to say that there's something that's substantially equivalent in the market, and yours is essentially, similar enough to be considered equivalent. And that allows for FDA clearance, not approval. Class 3, high-risk devices require PMA or pre-market approval. In this situation, you actually have to present data to the FDA that then gets renewed or reviewed, and there's a bit of back and forth. And then you'd actually get pre-market approval prior to, and that's like what truly FDA approved means. Class 1 products, really about half of the medical devices are considered Class 1 products, and the vast majority of those are exempt from the real regulatory process. You have to register the company, so you can't just decide to register it yourself. It has to be a company. You have to register the device, and you need to put together what's sort of called a quality management system. And this is kind of like a 25-page document. So if you can write a grant, you could probably do your QMS yourself. It takes a little bit of time, and there's a bunch of models that are free on the internet for that. But you have to say, how are you going to regulate it if there's a problem? If you get a call from a hospital that it didn't function as planned. Class 2 products, kind of moderate risk, is kind of roughly the other half. And these are the sorts of things, this pre-market submission, that it's substantially equivalent to something else that's already been cleared or approved. And that other thing that's already is called the predicate device. So it's interesting. This is not just some screenshots from the website. An umbilical clamp, plastic, pretty straightforward. This, however, is a Class 2 product. However, you take something like a hysteroscope and a hysteroscopic accessory, and this is considered a Class 1 product. So you just have to, there are some subtle differences, but those were kind of like the big categories. So who here hasn't had an idea? Gosh, I wish I thought of that. When you see something kind of cool that actually works, it might improve health. So I certainly had plenty of those things. And this was around 2012 or so. I was just kind of getting bored at my job. I think I'd been a full professor, and things were just coasting along, and I was bored. And then, like most things that you can't predict, I'm going to just jump ahead for a second. I'm unlikely to be an entrepreneur. I was not trained. I don't have an MBA. I have been really fortunate to be continuously NIH funded from when I was finishing my fellowship. I was just kind of lucky and in the right place at the right time, and ended up having a basic science R01 grant, and then have been the PI of the Pelvic Floor Disorders Network. I remember my first meeting, I sat around with like giants in the field thinking like, well, I'm totally out of place here. And they were very nice and kind of taught me along the way. I love minimally invasive surgery. I was at the University of Rochester for residency, and it got me hooked at that point. And I think it's also important to realize how your level of risk that you can tolerate. I'm not risk averse, but I certainly don't consider myself a crazy risk taker. But again, I had a lot of ideas and was getting bored. And then my wife got breast cancer in like 2012. And I'll just say, it's probably not polite, but life just sucked. Like it was a terrible, I was president of OBGYN at the time. The vaginal mesh crisis was going on, and it was really terrible. And at that point, I knew, like, I had my mortality moment. My dad had died when I was young. I knew that people died, like, I'm a physician, but for me, it was my mortality moment. And I no longer feared failure. I feared being on my deathbed with regret. And that sort of changed things for me. So this is us at the beach after the treatment. And there were a lot of good things where I decided to develop a patient positioner for Trendelenburg positioning. And the important thing about this picture also is that I have 3 boys that are small, medium, and large at the time. And this will come in a little helpful later on, and allowed me to use what resources I had available, including different size patients available to me. So I approached Duke, their Office of Licensing and Venture, and I suspect there's probably something similar, maybe called something different, but this is a group that kind of looks at intellectual properties and helps people through the process, even if you're like a total newbie as I was. And I was so naive, I didn't know anything. I just knew, for whatever reason, that I didn't want to have this thing that I thought I could patent, license it to a big company, and sort of get a check every month or something like that. I wanted to try to build a company, though I can tell you I did not know at all what I was doing at the time. So we went through the process, and at the end, like Duke evaluated it. They thought it was patentable, but it kind of wasn't in their wheelhouse. And they decided that maybe they weren't so interested in it. But the process of understanding like intellectual property versus prototype development, I thought I was just going to give them this idea and they were going to have somebody behind the scenes give me a prototype that I'd approve, and somehow they'd help me get a company. It just doesn't work like that. They were more on the left side of the screen. So afterward, I'm like, I have a great relationship. I continue to work with them, but they gave me 100% of it back. And people are like, wow, you got 100% back. That's great. But the reality is I had 100% of nothing. I didn't have a patent. I didn't have a prototype. I had nothing. So then the question was going to be, do I just stop there? Am I going to actually start this company or whatever, or develop this product? And I just decided, like, frankly, I didn't even decide. I just felt I needed to do it. So you got to be a little careful when you're starting. There are these non-disclosure agreements that you can sign with companies to make sure that they don't like steal your ideas. I've always said, like, it's probably better to submit a provisional patent before you start talking to a lot of other people about it. Google Patents is available for everyone, and you can search that very nicely, and it searches the US Patent Office and international patents to make sure that, you know, your idea is actually novel and not obvious. Those are the two things that you don't, you know, it has to be novel and it can't be obvious are the two things to be patented. And also you start to think about some trademarks and branding and things like that. So I started just getting foam. People would say that's egg crate foam. It's actually convoluted foam. Not all egg crate foam is the same. There's a lot of characteristics that I learned, and just tried to figure out. This is in our my company's headquarters, which is also the bonus room in my house. And we basically we've looked at different sizes and shapes to try to figure out, because what I wanted is an all-in-one positioner that you could shake, nothing was going to fall off. It wasn't a kit. It was going to be, you know, a very fast way of doing it. And I'm proud we can position patients up to, this is not an advertisement, but I'm saying you can position patients up to 400 pounds in under a minute. And that's kind of my goal of when I was trying to develop this. These are just different versions that we were trying to kind of perfect some of the different size, because you need the specifications to then go to a manufacturer. This is my medium-sized son that is testing it out to make sure. I've slept in it just to make sure it was comfortable overnight and that kind of stuff. This is me at a foam manufacturing plant trying to educate myself of what the different configuration or characteristics are of the foam. So you can have too soft, too hard. It's like a Goldilocks thing. You can actually have foam that's so hard it's uncomfortable to lay on. We came up with a logo that's sort of the overall shape of the product. And thought, you know, we hired somebody to help us do that. And this is like bootstrapping. Like we didn't have any investors. My kids thought I was totally crazy when I started this process. My wife was super supportive, but my kids, who are now very supportive and engaged in the process, thought I had lost my mind without a doubt. So then I had the pitch meeting. So this was the pitch meeting to a manufacturer that it was one of like the 200 cold calls I had made at the beach. And it was on a Saturday and I was stuck in the OR on Friday. So I needed to sew 3 industrial strength pieces of Velcro, and my sewing machine at home couldn't do it. So the tailors were all closed. This is like resourcefulness at its best. So I stopped at Jose Banks at a little after 8. I talked to the tailor who was just about to leave. I got him to sew that. I ran to Michael's, got spray adhesive, and got a vacuum, one of those space bags to vacuum seal it, because I wanted it to be vacuum sealed, but I wanted to show the manufacturer kind of a sort of near final prototype. And brought my vacuum cleaner to the hotel room so that I could vacuum seal it, just because I wasn't sure how long it was going to hold its thing. And voila, you have this sort of thing that I could show to the manufacturer before we actually launched it. This is me with my unabashed kind of selfie, trying to take a picture to kind of memorialize some of these crazy events in time. What was nice is we sort of hit it off and with this manufacturer. We have 2 manufacturers currently. One is in China, one's in Mexico, which allows us to sell to the VA. But I'm very proud that we're about a couple of weeks away from having a US manufacturer, I think, which I've been working with for a while. But China has a lot of benefits. Everybody thinks it's just cost. For me, as a busy, I have a busy day job, we can actually, it's 12 hours ahead. So at 8 p.m. at night, they're getting to the factory at 8 in the morning. They are incredibly efficient at iterating. So this is me taking a picture with a garbage bag from my house of where I wanted this clear plastic sheet. I took a picture of it, sent it to China. They quickly made the changes, showed me a picture of the final vacuum sealed package there. They ship it to my house, airship it as like a trial. a couple, during the iteration process, and we got to final prototype very, very quickly, like probably 6 weeks, which is actually quite fast when you're trying to develop a device. And then when we did that, it underscores the concept, if you read like business books on starting company, is that you have to take off before you run out of runway. And that runway is, the analogy for like money, upstart money. And you want to be in the top 2 boxes, not in the bottom 2 boxes. And it's important to also recognize that even after you take off, once you actually start selling it and you have a revenue stream, is what we're talking about, it is very expensive to keep that plane in the air, because warehousing costs and medical liability costs and things like that continue to increase. But while it's crazy and while I've never done this, it is a blast. And you actually can kind of see, I kind of think of it as like my 4th baby, I'll tell you. So it's been a fun thing of seeing it kind of mature and grow. I am, of all the things I might talk to you about, I'm terrible. I would never claim to talk to you about work-life balance, because I'm like way off in many of these regards. But I do think that my family have all become very involved in this. And my oldest son, they're all sort of engineering types. My oldest son is an intern in ortho, and we have a new way of insufflating the abdomen, that sort of would compete with some of the other pneumoinsufflation mechanisms. And he and I are co-inventors on the patent. So it's like it's been a really important process for me to bring this back into as a family sort of event. And the reason I say that is my dad, who I had mentioned, had passed away. His nickname was Nino, and I was trying to build a generational company. So I said, we're going to call it NinoMed. So I registered the company as NinoMed, and there are these squatters out there that basically, if you register a company, will steal your URL. So for a while, I didn't own ninomed.com, so I had to put a hyphen in there, and ultimately we got it back without paying for it, because they were charging like several $1,000s just to get that URL. So if you're thinking of starting a company, get your URL first, because there are squatters out there that'll take advantage of that. Okay, this is kind of our current logo and version. When you read books about like starting companies, the one that's I think very good is called The Lean Startup, and they talk about this concept of MVP, or minimum viable product. And this is like, it's good enough to get out the door. So like the first iPhone was not as good as the current version, the iPhone 13 that's there today. However, minimum viable product is sort of okay if you're holding a phone or something like that. But if you're using a medical device, this is like the responsible part. You need to make sure it's good enough for a patient or for you or your family member to use. So in that regard, I have a higher level, and make sure that any manufacturer that I work with recognizes that I have a higher level, and I'm not going to cut corners of things like that. So I think that's an important distinction between the typical MVP. So bootstrapping, as I sort of alluded to, is a way of starting a company without venture capital. And that is great. It's a little scary, and especially if you don't have any like experience doing it. But if you're passionate about it, you also have to be aware that maybe you're wrong and nobody cares about your product. And if the whole concept, if you're going to fail, you want to fail early so you don't, waste all that money just to find out it wasn't going to work anyway. So you have to be open to feedback, but sometimes you have to be passionate and push against some of the kind of negativity of just like, oh, why, you've never done this, why are you doing this sort of thing. So the pros and cons of this, and I just chose to do it this way. You can take other people's money and then you give up equity, kind of like a Shark Tank sort of thing. I didn't want to take money from friends and family. I would have felt horrible if I wasted their money or lost their money. I'd rather lose my own money. And you don't have to give up any equity if you can figure out a way of funding it yourself. And there are a bunch of ways of doing that. There are on LinkedIn Learning, there's a variety of different videos and learning opportunities of how do you start up a company. You start small, you don't buy a lot of real estate, you don't rent expensive, really cool, penthouse apartment or type things or offices, and you keep your finances, your expenses really, really low, and you get to market fast are the two kind of main takeaways for that. A VP of marketing at one of the large medical device companies gave me some great advice, and people really want to share what they've done. So, you talk to people. So they said, get a marketing brochure. So I was like, okay, so boom, I made a marketing brochure. Well, this is ridiculously bad. And I didn't do this. I was just trying to get some content for somebody who really does this for a living. I took a picture of my son. You can see how busy it is in the background. We took that, gave it to a graphics designer, we put a different head on, and suddenly you have a much more professional brochure, which is really the minimum expectation when there's representatives that are going out to kind of share your product with the world, basically. So you can see how quickly you can turn something that's like an idea into something that looks much more professional. It's without a doubt easier the subsequent times that you do it. We had I went to AORN a few years ago and learned about pressure ulcers and used the same foam and came up with a solution for pressure redistribution. We were able to get to market, in probably 6 months, start to finish, with all the marketing brochures and the FDA registration for this. So those are the sorts of things that once you learn it, you get the graphics designer, you call this, you're not looking for one, you have one. If you had a good relationship and a good work product, then you can continue to use those. It's a crazy ride. It's not all good. You have to have the stomach for it. And I think that's an important thing. You also have to have the mental capacity and fortitude to have the moments of deep despair, which I have had a few. So this was this was like in 2014. I was actually at this coffee shop working on one of the reapplications for I was writing the reapplication for the PFDN grant at the time. And, there had been this manufacturing sort of issue that basically the cost of goods sold was going to be 5 times what I had walked into my business plan thinking. I thought I was like dead in the water. And I was looking over next door, and there was this guy who was working on a laptop doing GYN surgical videos. And it was hysterectomies, and it's a small community. And I was interrupted him. I was like, "Hey, I'm sorry to bother you, but I feel like I should know you because I know exactly the procedure you're doing." And it was Matt Seedoff, who I'd never met, but was a minimally invasive surgeon, GYN surgeon at UNC, who ultimately took a job at Cedars. And we started talking about a variety of things, including Safety Secure. And he wanted to see it. And I was like, "Well, I have one in my car." And so I showed it to him on the trunk. And he was like, "Tony, you have a winner here." And, I was like, "Are you just saying that?" Or is are you really think it's a winner? And he's like, "Oh my God, this is exactly." And they ultimately use it at Cedars. But the point is that when I was in my moment of despair, sometimes little pick-me-ups like that, maybe it's divine intervention, but that's exactly what I needed to realize that, yes, it seemed insurmountable, but there was a solution out there. Most times you can find a solution, you can negotiate a path forward, and you can do it. And I use that so many times. I try to impart that to our residents and fellows, to my children, that there's usually a path forward. And if there's probably a win that most people will be able to get. So it's not just one person winning in a particular negotiation. It's a family business. So this is some of our brochures. We put them up in our kitchen to test them out. So our first show was in November of 2015 at AAGL. We had just rented at the very last minute. So it was like a 10 by 10 all the way at the back. I didn't have an OR table to display it. So I bought a $600 military OR table. These come in metal cases that they drop off out of planes with a parachute on them. It looked terrible. If you look to the right, we had to wrap the OR table with a black wrap that the utility tables are wrapped in for shows, because it looks so bad. But we launched, and that was an important sort of milestone. Hiring great people. This is Jack, our VP, and he allows me to have a day job that is busy, and I'm present for my day job, but he helps run the company without a doubt. But I will roll up my sleeves as well, and I think that's an important lesson, that if you're going to do something like this, rather than just license it, you have to be able to do some of the work. This is getting some setup done at one of the shows, but you can see from that first AAGL show, this is kind of where we are today. We have, what I'm very proud of is a rotating sign, which is, I think, kind of like the big boys. But we were able to really reach more people. And if you believe that something that you're doing is important and provides value, it's very easy to get excited about it. So if it doesn't matter, if it's just about making money, I think this is probably, I don't know, if you could probably find much easier ways of doing that. The reality is, if you start doing some of these things, you have to figure out how you get them here. And, we used to hire or order small little things. Now we're ordering several 40-foot containers at a time, but there's a huge expense now since COVID, but there's also, it takes time. So you order it, it takes a month to make this many, and then it takes about 6 weeks to ship them here. So as you're in growth mode, you have to start thinking, okay, I'm going to have to order in the future. And I have a a little bit of this fancy algorithm, and my wife just looks at me and she's like, don't be ridiculous, just order more. And she's always been right about many things, including that. So it's always good to have a little sounding board, because you don't want to order too much, but you also do not want to be on back order. We came close, but never actually ran out of stock. There are a variety of pros and cons to, like, where do you make this thing? And I think that more and more there's, given what's going on in the world, probably more of a push to make it in the US, but it's not been easy. And despite my efforts, I've not been successful in this, but I really feel that probably in the next month, we're going to have a US manufacturer. I've been working with 3 of them pretty seriously. It just takes time to do that. Warehousing is a huge thing that you start to realize you can't do it, as volume starts to grow. I never actually just sold them out of my house, but depending on how big the product is, you can't really do that and still have a normal life. So we have a warehouse, and it becomes very busy to try to do that. But again, you don't want to have so much inventory, and that balancing, because it's expensive to hold all that inventory month after month if you're not using it. So it's that you got to get that kind of sweet spot of inventory, and that becomes a separate thing. And the more products you have, the harder it gets. But it's doable. So this is just a sample of accounting software. So then I was so naive when I started this. So I'd register. We don't use distributors. I basically do direct vendor registration with all the health systems that we have, that are customers. But when they ordered their first purchase order, I was like all excited. I was like, yeah, I can ship it to them. But do they just pay? Am I supposed to send them a bill? It's an invoice. And before you know it, you get something like QuickBooks Online or something, and it generates. I could be on a plane and do it. I mean, we have a bookkeeping service that does it for us now, but you could generate a thing from your phone. So the technology has evolved to help support small businesses, which makes bootstrapping possible. Keeping the customer happy is always important. MedStar is one of our long-term customers, and long and short, I was giving a postgrad course in the Cayman Islands with my wife with me, and basically MedStar ran out. They hadn't ordered, and they had a case on Monday morning. Not a problem. UPS was notified they were going to drop ship something with a Saturday delivery. For some reasons, UPS just decided they weren't going to deliver it on Saturday, and it wouldn't deliver until Monday afternoon, which wasn't acceptable. And I spent a fair amount of time trying to find a solution. And this is like finding solutions. And ultimately, FedEx, I realized, has this sort of concierge, very expensive service where somebody came to my house. My son gave them an extra case that we had at the house just as a backup, and personally flew it to DC and delivered it to the OR manager's house at 9 o'clock at night. Now, that was very expensive. And I bore the entire cost because I just wanted to please the customer. I think we developed so much goodwill. It's essentially system-wide now, but I didn't do that because I had some ulterior motive. I just wanted to please the customer. And I think having that is the same sort of thing that drives us when we take really good care of patients. So for me, I don't view that as like a different sort of thing, especially because I know that there's a patient there Monday morning that, I wanted to benefit from this. So these are just some of our customers. And I don't show this to show off. I show this because I am so proud of the relationships that we have made over the years with all of these different the health systems. And that to me is probably just as important. It's not just about a sale. I want a long-term relationships with these people. These are just other sort of divisions that were in products that were kind of in development. The thing to remember is that when you're small, but you also have the incredible ability to pivot and to make quick decisions. During COVID, my son was a medical student in New York and would call me and say, like, Dad, we're running out of PPE. And I'd be like, they're going to figure it out. Don't worry about it. And he'd call me 2 days later. He's like, Dad, you're not taking me seriously. Like, we don't have masks and things like that. So I leveraged a bunch of relationships that I had with the manufacturers in China, and we started to provide really needed PPE. Now, I say that we were not going to price gouge. I made that very clear to everyone in the company. But when you look at this, you probably think you know what that means. During COVID, it did not mean anything related to the internet. It was the wild, wild west. I can just tell you, I was having conversations with hospital presidents, and this is what I'd say, which is crazy, but I'd be like, you're going to feel like you're negotiating a hostage release. You need to wire the money to my company, and I'm giving you no proof of life. And I could have never imagined saying that, but hospitals and health systems trusted me, and they wired money. I had never wired money in my life before. And then I wired the money to China and held my breath and hold that they were in Mexico and hope that they were going to deliver on their promise, which they all did. So the hospital presidents would be like, we want to go with you, we trust you, but you're only coming in at 60% of what everybody else is. So we sort of joked I could raise my price, but I was not going to price gouge. But I still feel like I'm proud of the fact that we had the ability to make a difference. We put a lot of our personal assets at risk, but I'm happy that we were able to do that and make a small help in a small way of what was really a pretty significant and continues to be pandemic. So these are just some of the other things that we added. I did develop a new product to help create an air seal, a better air seal between a regular mask that might be a high quality filtration mask, but there was air leaks around the side. Through that process, the reason I show this didn't, N95s became available too quickly. But the issue is I learned a lot about how to do injection molding and prototype design for this because I had other ideas. So I never felt like I was like wasting my time to perfect something like this. So I want easy in my life is what I tell my kids a lot. So we have a really nice 3D printer in our house, and you can see this start to feed this filament through. And those sorts of things, I can get ideas. I can tell my kids to design something for me. They can send me a prototype. I'm going to show you this. And then I can send it to the printer, sort of like you send a regular, a document to the printer. It will print and create this 3D model of something. It's usually there the next morning. And that for me has been, it shows you a video on your phone. So there are these things that allow you to become very, very efficient as you're kind of doing these different sort of out there sort of projects. So this is just an example of something that we're working on now. You can see if you can use, you may have never done a CAD design, but if you can do PowerPoint, you can figure out how to use this thing. So you've never done it before, it doesn't mean you don't have the skill set, inherently that you could kind of cultivate to do that. And when you do that, then you send it to the printer, and this is just it printing, and then boom, the next morning, it shows this. It's actually 5 hours to build this. This is made out of polypropylene. And you can start to test your different ideas and your products to see if they actually work. So a couple things. It's complicated, but it's doable. There's a lot of people out there to help you do that. But the intellectual property stuff is the stuff that you would have to probably negotiate with your institution of who owns the rights, licensing rights, that sort of stuff. The middle section is like, how do you get that to make it ready to sell? Regulatory pathways, things like that. You have to come up with an instructions for use, which are kind of detailed instructions of how to use the product. And there's a lot about manufacturing. You got to trust the people that are manufacturing their product. This is for patients. It has to be not just good enough. It has to have a very high bar, high quality. Then there's the business side of marketing. How do you do that? And accounting and things like that. Those things can all happen, but it takes a little bit of time. Okay. Totally changing gears on you guys. So that's how in my experience of how I've taken some medical devices to market. But we all observe things that we maybe let slip by and we don't always connect the dots. So this is a separate thing that I have been working on for a long time. I think most of the people, even locally, think I'm a little crazy about this. And that's what I love about that actually is because when I try, as the older I get and the less time I have left, I actually am very aware that I want to kind of live my life on the cusp between something that's crazy, bold, out there to something that after it's proven, it becomes obvious to people. And that's, if I can live on that the rest of my life, it's like surfing a wave or something. I'd be so happy if I could do that. So we have a lot of experience in medicine where people originally were kind of poo-pooed with their ideas and it turned out to be right. I mean, Harvey came up with a concept of the heart with circulation, but didn't even understand the role of oxygen or the lungs. As we go further, do you recognize this gentleman? Gregor Mendel. So Gregor was a brilliant guy who couldn't even pass his teaching exams despite taking it multiple times, and ended up just becoming a substitute teacher, but really was observant and kind of revolutionized our general understanding of basic genetics. Gastric ulcers. There's no way that a bacteria could live in the stomach. It can't be an infectious disease. The low pH of the acid would never allow that to happen. That's crazy, right? Chill out. You're going to give yourself an ulcer. It's a type A personality. And then we quickly realized that was not the case when people actually bucked the system and questioned the status quo. With that said, you got to be careful. You can't read too much into the data and then you go down the wrong path and try to think that there's actually a homunculus, is like the way that, fertilization happens. So if we think about preterm labor, what's the cause? I mean, the reality is, and this is no, insult to MFMs or OBs, but we don't really understand what even causes labor or triggers labor, much less preterm labor. We know like multiple gestations or previous preterm labor or rupture of membranes or infection, but do we understand the mechanism? So I think we should be looking at these problems differently. So I've left the OB world. I haven't delivered a baby since our 18-year-old, because I delivered our 3 kids. And the joke is like my wife helped also, because my kids would be like, I'd be like, who did all the work when you were born? And they'd look at me, they're like, you did, Dad. I'd be like, no, your mom helped a little bit. But the reality is I spent my life not caring for pregnant patients, but for overactive bladders. Muscarinic receptors are ubiquitous, right? They are all over our bodies for a reason. When we look at medications that we use for overactive bladder, they can give you dry mouth, dry eyes, or constipation because they're impacting the receptors in these other glands. Embryologically, and I'm a little bit of an embryology nerd, the intermediate mesoderm is the same layer that forms both the urinary and the genital system. So there's similarities just from literally the very beginning. If you look at the anatomy, I would describe the uterus as a hollow pelvic organ, 2 proximal inlets, 1 distal outlet, smooth muscle coming off the internal iliac. I know another organ in the pelvis that shares those characteristics, shares the same nerve supply from the hypogastric nerve. If we think about the parasympathetic nervous system, we have a gap between the nerve and the muscle, and we have a release of acetylcholine on the presynaptic side, and we have a receptor on the other end. So if we want to screw that system up, we either block the receptor or we block the release of the neurotransmitter. So in the bladders, we use Botox. So we block the transmission of acetylcholine, or the release, or we can use pills and it blocks the receptors. So if we think about things a little bit differently, we want to also realize that the type of receptor matters. And in the bladder, it's M2 and M3, with M3 really kind of being the dominant receptor. And guess what? That's the same thing that's going on in the uterus as well. So the M2 and M3, this is just some northern blots that show that there's M2 and M3 mRNA in the uterus. This just shows that carbachol is a muscarinic agonist, and that basically M2 and M3 activity can be blocked. So proving that there's some function of the M2 and M3 receptors in the uterus. Now we're about to start a very interesting study. This is like my geek hat on, because I'm not a basic scientist, so I struggle with this. But basically, if you take a wild type, which is like a run-of-the-mill sort of mouse, and then you build some knockout mice, basically they're identical to that wild type, except like on the left side, you have no M2 receptor or no M3 receptor. And we've bred some that they don't have an M2 or M3 receptor. We have implantable telemetry units, and we're monitoring their labor to see if there's a difference in patients or like mice that don't have M2 or M3 receptors. Now, if we think differently, there is a plethora of anticholinergics that have been tested in humans, in bladders, as well as the trospium in the bottom left, which is a quaternary amine. So the structure is differently. It's supposed to not cross the blood-brain barrier. I don't think we fully know if it's crossing the placental barrier. And mirbetrix, which is totally kind of the not so new, but new kid on the block, which is a beta-3 agonist that causes relaxation. So oxybutynin, really cool. Old, it's been out since the 80s. If you look at that, when I pulled the papers that were submitted to the FDA for their approval, what was the problem? At higher doses, it increased the mean duration of gestation. It caused dystocia. Pups died. That on the surface doesn't look so good, I get it. But basically, pups were stuck inside because it seems like there wasn't enough expulsive forces of the uterus, which sort of would be something that maybe we could take advantage of someday. Don't try this at home tomorrow or on labor and delivery today. But that's something that could be investigated. Now we see there's RCTs. This is like a relatively somewhat older RCT. I think you guys are all aware of this, I'm sure, of giving progesterone to help prevent preterm labor in patient or preterm delivery in patients who'd had a previous preterm delivery. And it showed that there was a risk reduction. I know that there's more recent stuff that's actually questioning this. But what we found is, and this is actually not our data, this is with some gut work, that basically progesterone is working to block the receptor, that muscarinic receptor. Okay, so that's a very different thing. When we talk about progesterone, like it's a smooth muscle relaxant, but nobody's really talking about the actual mechanism that that works by. So we use progesterone. It seems to work potentially to help prevent preterm deliveries, but we don't really understand why. It's possible, again, possible, not proven, that we're actually giving progesterone to relax the smooth muscle or whatever, but it might be working to block the muscarinic receptor. Maybe, and I can't say enough maybes because this is unproven theory on my part. If we further think, challenge ourselves to think differently, what about magnesium? People still use that to treat preterm labor. Sometimes it seems to be falling out of favor, but maybe it can work differently. Could it be possible that it's working at that interface between the nerve and the muscle? So there's evidence to show that magnesium works by inhibiting the release of acetylcholine. I mean, that's how Botox works. It's just a different mechanism, like a SNAP protein. But basically, if you can prevent the release of acetylcholine or you can block the receptor, you probably can impact things. This is a study. Don't forget about old studies. They may have done it for a different purpose. You can go back. This is the 1950s. And this shows on the y-axis, it's acetylcholine release. That the more magnesium you give, the less acetylcholine release you get. It's also reversible. So you decrease the drip of magnesium and you get an increase, or getting towards back to baseline of acetylcholine release. And it's actually pretty cool that calcium reverses that. So, I mean, we all know that you give calcium if you have mag toxicity. In this situation, it can reverse not just the kind of symptomatic mag toxicity potentially, but it reverses the output of acetylcholine. So are these the same or are they different? I would argue that they're more similar than they are different. So they come from the same embryologic origin. They both are hollow pelvic organs that have smooth muscle, 2 inlets, 1 outlet, same blood supply, same nerve supply. They both have a longer sympathetic storage phase and shorter parasympathetic expulsive phase, and they have very similar muscarinic profiles. So we submitted a patent for this that was awarded by the US Patent Office. If you look at something like I'm not a chemical engineer, so if you do something like this, it is expensive because you need to hire chemical engineer patent attorneys, which are probably 50% more than what everyone else is. But if we're, and our goal is not to stop people. If this works, and this turns out to be a radical improvement in our treatment of preterm labor, we're not trying to stop anybody from doing this, but we certainly wanted to protect this idea. So do I even think preterm labor exists? I do not. I actually think that instead of preterm labor, all we have is an overactive uterus, similar to the overactive bladder. So I know I ran through a lot of different things and I wanted to leave some time for questions, but I wanted to kind of give you a sense of what's possible. So happy to entertain questions.
Thanks, Tony. That was fantastic. Really enjoyed it. I was wondering, because like you probably, and like everybody, have that moment of idea that somebody should do this. My wife and I my wife's an OBGYN as well. I don't know if you and I have ever discussed that, but so we talk about stuff like that all the time over dinner, and it makes our children very uncomfortable. Yeah. But I was curious if there was a relationship you made at some point in time in the process that was critical to your success that was outside of healthcare. Like I heard we have the exact same thing here at the UW that you described.
Sure.
But I didn't hear a relationship that was formed really out of that. Or was there anybody in the kind of manufacturing or implementation that you felt was critical to the long-term success?
That's a great question. I think that there was probably not one person at Duke in particular that that was the one person who was my mentor throughout the whole thing. I think anyone that I have talked to, either in engineering or in the Office of Licensing and Ventures, has been like enormously gracious and wanting to help. I think in the beginning, I just didn't know what even to ask. People would be like, well, what's your goal? Do you want to start a company? I'd be like, I don't even know what that means. I knew enough that I didn't know enough to answer the question. So I think it's wherever you are, there's probably a variety of different people to kind of engage with,
to work work that
but
way.
probably not one person. But
There's not one person, not a critical relationship you need to see it through. It's really you were driving the whole thing, and a lot of people you worked with through the process.
Yeah, I like was barreling through because I knew I could get it done. It's not even that I knew I could get it done. It's hard. I just felt like I needed, like it wasn't even an option. I had to do this.
Yeah.
So that I think it was something that was, obviously I'm passionate about. But you need different, just like with like residents or medical students, like this concept of having a mentor, I think is like a little antiquated. I think you need multiple mentors. So, Eric Wagner is a great patent attorney at Duke. Now we have our own patent attorneys for our company, but they actually work really well together. For business development, it's a different person. They have these kind of corporate folks in residence that you can bounce ideas off of, and trying to figure out how do you engage with people like Stryker and things like that, because there might be opportunities to do that. But I would say in the beginning, try to get not like a widget or something like that, but something simple that you can kind of see in your mind. You could sort of maybe even make at home and try that, or just like if I wanted to come up with a new insufflator or something, I mean, that would be kind of complicated. Our solution, for instance, is like an adapter to an existing one.
Sure.
I just think in the beginning, maybe we'll like grow into those things, but I think in the beginning, it's hard to do that and still especially still have like a day job.
Yeah.
In that situation, you could just license it. And if you have a great idea that even if it's complicated, you can do that. It's just a matter of licensing it to somebody else that has the infrastructure. Because you would get, the other people, the regulatory people, how do you, so this one product that we're developing within Duke is a class 1. I felt pretty sure it was going to be a class 1 product, but I'm not a regulatory expert. So we have had some relationships with those.
Well, thanks so much. Really inspiring.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, hello.
Hi, that was really interesting. And I very much relate to when you said this became like your 4th child. My partner has a young business, and it really is like her child too. Yeah. I was wondering, so you put the intellectual property at the very beginning, which makes sense. But when you think about a product and you're getting excited about it, how to sell it, how to market it, make the brochures and everything, it seems that IP may fall by the wayside, or is you're already spending so much on getting your product manufactured and the marketing, how do you manage to also do the IP? Because that's quite expensive as well, right? You have to.
Yeah, so it depends. Yeah, no, it's great. So this concept of like, a patent, $6,000 or $10,000, I can tell you several multiples of that. So you have to start and decide, is it worth doing? You do have a bit of space. So a provisional patent or a PCT if you want to be able to, so we have international patents on these things, but a PCT is like a provisional patent at the international level. But the point is that's pretty cheap. It's a couple $1,000s to submit that. And then you've sort of protected it. Once you have that provisional patent, you can start talking to manufacturers and things like that. And then I just said, during that year runway of IP, protection, that's not really costing me that much. I am going to go crazy to try to get it launched and available during that 1-year grace period. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that once the costs really start, then I have to make a decision. Am I going to go forward with this and go through the full, like the international patents, you can do like the EU, but then each country has their own, then you have to hire attorneys in those countries. And then you have to have translations it becomes expensive. You can't that becomes a little bit too much. So you have to be choosy looking at what's your market in those countries. And you pick the countries that do the most. Like, for instance, some of these will be used for minimally invasive surgery. If there's a country that doesn't do minimally invasive surgery, I wouldn't invest the money to try to protect there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Tony, I have a question for you. First of all, thank you so much. That was excellent. I've learned a whole nother part of your career. And so thank you for sharing with us today. I understand the inspiration. Although I don't think I could have invented an intraoperative positioning device like you have, but how do you find your inspiration? I think about, the most recent patent that you shared with us and the overactive uterus, like how do you, what is your process, or how do those types of thoughts and pursuit, how does that develop?
Yeah, great question. So I think we all possess those sorts of qualities of like curiosity. So we might just figure out, how can we help a patient? How can we do a research study? And I think once you let yourself think about that, I spend my life frustrated by things that could be more efficient or things like, and I'm now like, okay, rather than just being frustrated by that, can I think of some way of making it more efficient? And that's the one thing. As far as the overactive bladder, I just love the fact that people, in medicine in particular, like Lister, right? I mean, like wash your hands kind of thing. It used to be a badge of honor to like rub the blood on your thing and go patient to patient, and I'm not going to wash my hands, and then people thought he was crazy, right? And then it turned out like maybe there was something to actually like infectious spread. So I think those are just questioning the status quo and making connections of things and saying, hey, what if? Like, I think this, like, could it be possible, as crazy as it sounds, that whatever, like, could prolapse, okay, be an infectious disease? Like, probably not. I don't think it is. Probably, like, I don't really think like, but it could be. Like, I'm open to that potential. And I think that's, once you start doing some of those things, it just opens your mind, and you're not encumbered by like what we've been taught in med school and what's in the textbooks and what kind of, I think, limits us to some degree.
Anyone with other questions for the esteemed Dr. Visco? Can't see the hands flying up. Well, Tony, I don't see anybody jumping out, but thank you so much. It was a real pleasure, and I really hope you come visit sometime soon, because we'd love to have you come in person. And
it'd be nice to see everybody in person.
Good luck at SGS, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for your help too. Bye-bye. See ya.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.